Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of our How to Start a Sourdough Starter series. Thank you, Jesus. It is another beautiful day to be in the kitchen, and today is a very exciting day because you've been feeding your starter, you've been watching it, you've been bathing it. Well, today it's time to learn how to use your starter. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Today we will be making a loaf of sourdough bread using our new sourdough starter that we learned how to make in our How to Start a Starter series. That's what's coming up today. So stay tuned. Okay, so the dough has finished bulk fermenting, and that took about an hour plus about an hour and 30 minutes. Now, that all depends on the temperature of your dough. So if your dough is anywhere over 75 degrees, you may want to let your dough bulk ferment for 1 hour. If your dough is between 72 degrees, you can let it go for maybe like an hour and 15 minutes. My dough is fairly cool because the house is not super hot. So mine bulk fermented at 69 degrees, and I did take the temperature just to make sure. So the colder it is, you can let it sit just a little bit longer. Now, as I said earlier, keep your dough at an ideal temperature. You don't want it to go over 78, 79 degrees. When your dough goes over into the 80-degree range, your dough is too warm. And that can be a problem because your dough can over ferment and it'll be very sour, and not the kind of sour we want. We want sourdough, but we don't want puckery sourdough. And another thing, your dough, when you do bake it, it will not rise because the sourdough yeast got overexcited. And once it gets overexcited, it's used up all of its energy. It's spent. So when you go to bake your loaf of sourdough bread, it has and it'll just be like, I can't do this. And it won't do it. And you'll end up with a very sad, squat loaf, and not what we want for all the hard work that we're putting into making a loaf of bread. So pay attention to your timing, your temperature, and your texture. And those are the three important things about sourdough. Is really the key to sourdough baking. If you learn those 3 T's, you will be a good sourdough baker, and you'll be a better sourdough baker. And those things come with attention, and they come with practice, because as they say, practice makes perfect. And the more you do it, the better you'll be at it. So, getting the feel of the dough, how does it look? How cool is it? What does it look like? Does it look like it's doing anything? Those are things that you learn as you go along. So don't despair if it's not, you're like, well, I don't know right off the bat. You'll learn. That's why we're here, so we all can learn. So I have my ready dough out on a marble surface, and I'm just going to use a little bit of flour. This is actually a combination of rice flour and all-purpose flour. And rice flour, it prevents the all-purpose flour from just absorbing into the dough. Rice flour kind of just sits on the surface. So you do want to be light-handed about it. So I'm just going to dust just a teeny bit on my hand. And now I'm going to do what's called a pre-shaping. Because this loaf of bread, once it goes into our oven, it must support itself. Yes, the Dutch oven will help. But this is even more so important if you're not going to be using a Dutch oven and you're going to be baking the dough freehand going onto a baking sheet. You've got to give it a pre-shape. So a pre-shape is important because, especially for sourdough, it will be very stubborn about holding its shape because for all intents and purposes, it's a fairly lax dough. Not like, your stiffer yeast doughs. Sourdough is fairly lax. So I'm going to pre-shape this dough the same as I would pre-shape a bowl, a round. So all pre-shaping start the same way, regardless of the finished shape of the loaf. They all start out as a round ball of dough. So I'm just going to take the corners and fold them in and be gentle. You're not trying to manhandle the dough at this point. Now, when I come to the last fold, I'm going to just take my hand. I can also use my bench knife. Take my hand and flip it over, just like that. Just take it and flip it right over. And then, let me see, slow down. So, take your bench knife and do a rolling and a tucking motion, just like that, clockwise. Take each corner, roll and tuck like that. If you find that the plastic one helps a little better, you can do that. And let your hand be a support. So, go around like that. And what you're doing is you're creating some tension in the dough. You can do this without a bench scraper, by the way. And to do this without a bench scraper, and you don't want to overdo this, but to do it without a bench scraper, you take your two hands and you put them like this, just like you're framing something. And you literally take these two fingers and you tuck them under the loaf and kind of pinch as you do that same rotating motion. So just go round and pinch. And round and pinch and round. You're creating tension in the dough. You're also teaching the dough that it now must support itself. So just go round like that. Don't overdo it because this is just pre-shaping. So there's no need to go wild. Now I just like to sprinkle tiny bit of flour down and set the dough down like that. And I like to dust just a tiny bit on top. This prevents the dough, especially in the summertime, it prevents it from becoming sticky. And also if you're doing multiple doughs, as I do, you don't want them to stick to one another. So just leave it alone at this point. I'm going to cover it up. I'm going to put the bowl on top of it and cover it up and let it rest for about 30 minutes. The reason why you gotta let it rest is because you've created tension in it and it needs to relax. Otherwise, you'll be fighting the dough the whole time and you'll never be able to shape it. And another thing, if you do try to shape it, it will tear. So cover it up, let it rest, and in 30 minutes we'll come back and then we'll be ready for the final shaping. So while the dough is resting, I want to talk a little bit about textures of dough. Because this is where this is your last chance to kind of manipulate your dough before it's done and you really can't meddle with it anymore. So if you notice this dough, I'm just going to uncover it for a minute. This dough has a slight, it's not exactly sticky, but it's tacky. It should not be excessively sticky to the fingers. If it is, your dough is overhydrated and you added just, okay, so the timer is going off for the dough, so it's ready for shaping. But before I shape it, let me tell you this. So if your dough is overly sticky, you'll know that in the stretch and fold stage because it'll be like, it'll never really, it will form a dough, but it'll always be super sticky and you're constantly wetting your hands more than is necessary. That's a sign of an overhydrated dough. Now, if you do have an overhydrated dough, what can you do? You would monitor that when you are mixing the actual dough itself. In the mixing stage is when you can do something about that. And that is, you can simply add in more flour. However, if you weigh your water, you can avoid that. And you want to avoid overhydrating your dough by any means, because if your dough is overhydrated, you will not get this nice, firm, but soft texture. And when you try to bake a loaf that's overhydrated, it won't hold its shape because there's too much moisture in the dough to allow it to develop a nice strong structure. Another reason why your dough could be excessively sticky is because your flour is too low in protein levels. So if you're using all-purpose flour. You can make a decent dough out of that, but this is bread, and bread needs more structure than cake, way more structure than cake. And if you have doughs with a lot of inclusions in them, such as butter and eggs and all those extra things, they are adding protein with the eggs, some structure to the dough, which helps it. So you can get away with making a brioche with all-purpose flour, is really my point. When it comes to a bread, and we want more of a chew than a soft crumb, you need a higher protein flour, such as bread flour. And then there's also a high gluten flour, or a whole grain flour. And because it doesn't have to be whole wheat, you can use another type of grain. But the protein will help you have structure to the loaf, and that will help prevent a super sticky, very weak dough. But as I say, weigh your water. That's the most important thing. And you can avoid a super sticky dough. And remember, always never add in the exact amount of water that a recipe calls for, whether it's mine or somebody else's, because flour changes. The temperature in your house is different. The humidity in your house is different. And some days flour needs more moisture, and then other days flour needs less. You've overproofed it, meaning you let it sit too long in the bulk fermenting stage. After you've done your stretch and folds, you move into the bulk ferment. And if you let it sit too long, and your flour it'll have a weird texture, and you'll know it because it'll be obvious. It'll be very sticky, and you won't be able to shape it. It'll start tearing easily because the dough has lost all of its confidence, and it's now some sort of sticky mass. Now, if that happens to you, if you over bulk ferment and your dough has turned sticky, there's not really much going back with that kind of dough. And the reason why is because your sourdough has it's lost its will to rise, put it that way. It's lost its will to work. And another reason why, the excessive fermenting makes the sourdough starter more and more acidic. And the more and more acidic it is, it has less ability. It's starting to devour itself. That's what happens. So it's like, and let's look at it in terms of a 4. If it's decreased and 3 have been devoured, you're only left with 1. And 1 is not enough to rise a loaf of bread, if that kind of breaks it down a little more simpler. You're now running off of 1 bar instead of, a loaf that was running a full blast on 4 bars. You're now running off of 1 bar because it's gone way past the I'm ready, and now it's lost its confidence and is starting to actually devour itself, the wild yeast. So that could be another reason why your dough is overly sticky to you. So that's a quick little tip if you're having trouble, or if you have questions about dough textures, temperatures, and of course, time. So before I begin shaping my loaf, I'm going to go ahead and prepare my banneton. So I'm just going to take a little bit of this rice flour and just sprinkle it all around. You don't have to go too wild. My banneton is well used, so it's already kind of broken in. But if you have a new banneton, you definitely want to make sure that you flour it well with the rice flour. So now it's time to shape this loaf into our shape. Now, since I am using an oval banneton to make a batard, I am going to shape this as a batard. But a round shape is the same that we did with the pre-shaping. You just repeat that process and make it a little bit more firm than you did with the loose pre-shaping. But since I'm shaping this one into a batard, I'm going to show you how to do that. So we need to flip this dough over. So I'm just going to begin by gently loosening it from the counter, and then just flip it right over. Now you take your dough and kind of get yourself a little bit of a square shape. There we are. And then if you have any excess flour, you can brush it off because you want it to kind of stick to itself. So take these two corners here and fold it over just like that. And then just give it a little tuck. No need to try to make it stick. If the dough is nicely tacky, it'll stick itself. And then take these two corners and flip them over that way, like that. And you can give them a little pinch, just like that. Now, take your two top corners, fold them over, just like that. And then using your two thumbs, like this, use your thumbs to tuck it in, just like that. And then take your fingers here, pick this corner up and fold it over. Now your thumbs is caught in underneath. And then you just whoop, whoop, work your thumbs out. Now repeat that motion again with your thumbs. Keep your thumbs there, like that. And then flip like this. And repeat that motion. I'm going to do that one more time. Push. This time I'm pushing in and I'm using my fingers to roll the dough over on itself. Just like that. And let me get my thumb out. Now you have a cylinder shape. So keeping those thumbs, because your thumbs is really important when you're shaping a batard. Take your thumbs and tuck and tuck and tuck and tuck. What you're doing is you're squeezing that seam underneath, like that. And now, flip it back over, and you see how it's sealed. That seam is nicely sealed. Now, just take your hands and pinch the corners, just like that. Just pinch them in. If your dough is a little, you may have to manipulate it to get it sticky enough to where it'll pinch, but don't worry too much about that. It'll stick to itself and it'll behave. Okay, and that is how you shape a batard. So just like to pick it up, you notice how there's a little seam running along here. That seam will be there and it'll be an obvious seam, but this is the underside of it. So take your banister. And I like to use, I'm right-handed, so I use my right hand. And take your top left hand, set it right on top. And you're just gently rolling the dough into your hand. And pick it up like that. And then use the same motion to roll the dough into the banister like that. And that's all. You don't need to do anything else. If you have a very large loaf, this isn't the largest loaf that I make, but if you have a very large loaf, you may need to pinch the two ends together again. But again, that depends on how well you kind of pinch them when you were shaping it in the beginning. And you want to cover this with something so that it doesn't dry out when you put it in the fridge to cold proof. So I like to use these little plastic shower caps that I bought off of Amazon. They're actually not shower caps. They're for this, but they look just like a shower cap. And you want to put this in the refrigerator. So this is ready to go into the refrigerator to cold proof. Now, cold proofing is important because this is where your dough starts to develop flavor. So at this point, we've developed texture, we've developed shape, and we've also developed the rising leavening part of the dough. Now we want to develop the flavor of the dough, and that can only happen by letting it sit and rest and rise. So I'm going to put this loaf in the fridge and let it cold proof. So don't go over 20 hours. If you go over 20 hours, your dough will begin to become too sour. So mine is typically between 18, hours, sometimes 16, but it depends on when I want to bake. If I want to start baking at 3 o'clock in the morning and they went in at 3 o'clock, well, that's 12 hours. That's plenty of time for your dough to have gotten some cold proof. Now, that may sound frightening, the idea of, I got to get up at 6 o'clock and bake the bread. No, time it depending on when you put it in to sleep for its bulk ferment. So if I put this in at 5 o'clock this evening, say I started it, at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and by 5 o'clock, my dough is ready to go for cold proofing. Well, 5 o'clock the next morning, that is 12 hours. And if I'm looking for an 18-hour cold proof, and it's 5 o'clock from 5 to 5, that's 12 hours, well, then I know I start baking at 11 o'clock. So this is where you can kind of manipulate your dough to suit your schedule. And that all depends, as I say, on you and when you get it in the oven. I mean, when you start to cold proof it. So that's where you can tinker with the time. And the temperature helps, because if your refrigerator is cold, as most refrigerators are, your dough kind of goes, it's neither asleep nor is it awake. It's kind of like in that in-between resting stage. But it can overproof if you let it cold proof too long, especially this kind of dough. So mine is 18 hours cold proof, and then I am ready to bake. And as I say, my dough, which is 301 right now, my doughs are usually always ready to go into the cold proof 301 to start baking early in the morning. Now, I'm not gonna promise you guys that I will get up at 6 o'clock or really at 5 o'clock, because the ovens have to heat. To bake one loaf of bread, and I don't suggest that you do that either. But I know that in the morning my dough will be ready to bake. So it's time to set it aside, let it take its time and rise, and the good Lord willing, this loaf will be ready to bake. So see you on the other side. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well rested. It is the next morning, and the sourdough is well rested in the fridge. Oh, wow, it looks nice. And you see how it has risen from the level that it was in the pan. It has risen a good bit. Now, it should not overproof. And that's something, sourdough should not, it should not, like rise all up in your Banneton. If it does, it's overproofed. So this will get the rest of its proving from the oven spring when it goes into the oven. You can use a parchment sling, which can become a little brittle. So here I have, this is a, it's for bread, and it's a liner that goes into your Dutch ovens and allow you to lift the bread out of a Dutch oven, because otherwise it can become a little tricky. You can use parchment, by the way, if you want to. But I prefer to use these, especially if you're baking a lot of sourdough bread. It's washable and it's reusable, and it's silicone, so it's heat safe. So I just like to lay this right over the top. And my oven is preheated to 450 degrees with the Dutch oven in the oven, preheating right along with the oven. So the Dutch oven is 450 degrees and the oven itself is 450 degrees. Now, sometimes your dough goes on, your loaf goes on a little weird, so just straighten it up. You want to get this excess flour off. It did its job by making sure that your loaf comes out of your Banneton easily. But now you want to get rid of it. So just use a pastry brush and gently get rid of that. Now, there's a whole lot online about scoring and all of those things. And that's entirely up to you. There are books on scoring. There are tutorials on scoring. There are all kinds of scoring techniques. But I stick with a fairly basic but pretty scoring technique for my sourdough. Now, this is a lame, spelled L-A-M-E, lame. It looks like lame, but it's pronounced lame. And you have long ones that have a long handle on them, or you have these short ones, like this one that I'm using. And I prefer the short one to the long one because the long ones can get a little fiddly. This one gives me a little bit more, especially if you're doing intricate scoring. If you're just slashing the loaf before it goes into the oven, that's fine. You only need the regular lame. And I'm trying to keep this out of my gesture hand because these things are razor blades. That's all it is. It's a razor blade within a wooden handle that gives you safety when handling this razor blade. You can use a regular razor. You can also use a sharp knife, but a knife, if you're just starting, a knife will work. But if you're going to be serious about it, you probably want to invest in a lum, and they're not expensive. They can be, but they don't have to be. So how you score matters. And you want to, your intricate decorative scoring has nothing to do with your purposeful scoring. So the first scoring I'm going to do is going to be the decorative scoring. So I go on the diagonal of this and this, just like that, and go down, 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 just like branches on a tree. So I start with one, so you can see it good. I start with one here. You kind of want to be quick and purposeful. Once you're scoring there, go ahead and do it. Don't keep yanking at it, because you start to aggravate the dough. So I start on the left side, go down, and as I say, just be purposeful, and then switch your blade to a different angle. So the first angle was this angle. Switch your blade to this angle, and go right across and score. And you want your scoring to be fairly deep, because if you don't make it deep enough, you can always go back over it and just kind of open those up a little bit. If you're not purposeful about your score, what happens is it will close up, or it won't open up because you didn't cut it deep enough. It'll just look like little scratches on the surface. So make sure you go in about a good 1/2 inch. So that's the decorative scoring. Now let's do the real scoring that will give you that beautiful ear that'll open up your loaf. If you do not score a sourdough loaf, what happens is when you put it in the oven, it's gonna split itself, because that pressure has nowhere to go. So when you score, you kind of tell the dough where you want it to split. But if you don't do it, it'll do it on its own, and it's usually not very pretty. That's why we score. So now your purposeful scoring, which is usually just one, start right here and at an angle. I've got my blade at an angle like this. And you, with a quick slash, go straight down, just like that. You don't have to think about it. You can always go back and kind of cut a little deeper. You don't have to think about it. Don't meditate. Just do it. And that's it. Now I'm going to go and grab my Dutch oven out of the oven and bring it over. Okay, here is the Dutch oven, preheated Dutch oven. And these things are seriously hot. So just whatever you do, be careful. So just take the lid off. Ooh, the smoke comes out. And just be cautious and be quick about this. Don't linger. So just pick your dough up from this end. And my dough wants to hang off the side a little. And there we are. Just, if that happens, and it does happen, actually it happened to me quite a lot. So just go ahead and set it in. Don't think about it. I do want to mention is, if this is your first sourdough, just take a few drops of water and pour it, just a few drops, pour it in. That'll give you a little more steam, and then put the lid on. There we are. Put the lid on, and immediately, don't waste any time, immediately put this right into the oven and set the timer for 30 minutes. Okay, the bread is in the oven. Now you're gonna bake your loaf at 450 degrees with the lid on the Dutch oven for 30 minutes. Then you remove the lid from the oven, from the Dutch oven, and put the Dutch oven back in the oven and let it continue to bake for about 15 minutes until it develops a nice golden brown color. Because if you bake it covered the whole time, depending on if you're using a black cast iron Dutch oven, they can brown. Because I have one that is, I don't know, oh boy, that was well over 100 years old. My uncle gave it to me, actually. And it will brown a loaf of sourdough without you taking the lid off. But that is a black, well seasoned cast iron Dutch oven. With the enamel ones, such as that one that I have, and I'll talk more in another video about various types of Dutch ovens that you can use. With the enamel one that I have, it doesn't brown unless I take the lid off. So 30 minutes, 450 degrees, covered, and then remove the cover, and about 10 to 15 minutes without the lid on. And then we'll take the bread out and see how it looks. Okay, now it's several hours later, and I let the bread completely cool. Now, as much as we all want to go tearing into our loaves the moment they come out of the oven, it's really a good idea if you let bread cool completely. Now, I'm going to throw damper on your excitement by telling you that, but the reason why is the bread is kind of like carryover cooking with meat. And if you, of course, you cut right into it, all your juices go flooding out. So you let it rest. The same thing with bread. If you cut into it right out of the oven, all of the steam has not settled out of the loaf. So your bread will be a little gummy. It'll be crusty on the outside, but then it'll kind of just gum up when you go to cut it. So the remedy to that is just have a little more patience and let it cool. We waited all this time on the bread, so we can wait just a little bit longer. But now the waiting is over. It is time to cut into this bread. And oh, wow. Thank you, Jesus. Look at that ear. It looks good. Now, this is called the ear of the loaf. So this is where I did the scoring this morning. And you can see the dough expanded. And literally, this just shows the expansion of the dough. So this was here this morning. And so it has risen, and that's about as much an ear as you want your dough to have. If your ear is too expansive, unless you're making a really large loaf of bread, as I say, this is a small to medium size loaf of sourdough, because of course it's your beginner loaf, so you don't want to really have to worry about handling large batches of dough. So you don't want the ear the ear will not expand but so much with a medium-sized loaf. And the larger loaf would have a larger ear, but it would just be taller because there's more dough to it, if that makes any sense. And you can see the scoring is still visible because it was deep enough to catch. Now, the scoring on this is clearly not as deep as the scoring for our ear. This is our decorative scoring, and of course this was our purposeful scoring. So this was a little bit deeper. This you don't need to do. You don't need to do a decorative scoring. It just makes it, add something to the dough. But for your first loaf, if you don't want to bother with all that, don't worry about it. Just do your purposeful score and you're good to go. Now, if you're doing a round sourdough, your scoring will be similar to this one. It'll just be a little different because you would score with around the dough so that the ear would rise up this way. Or you can do the cross scoring. That all depends. I'm not a fan of the cross scoring because you get 4 of these ears on the cross scoring, and each of those, when they puff up, they can kind of burn. So I'm not a massive fan of doing a cross score on bread, but if you want to, that's perfectly up to you. So enough talking. Now it's time to slice the loaf, and it's going to be noisy. And stop when you're near. You don't have to slice all the way through. As you see, I didn't. Just stop when you're right near the end and then pull it open. That's ideal. And thank you, Jesus. Look at all those air bubbles. Oh, wow. It smells so good. Oh, wow. It smells delicious, and I cannot wait to tuck in. Now, I'm not a butter and bread person. I prefer to eat my bread really just plain because I like to dunk my bread in tea. But if you love butter, well, get your butter out because we'll be buttering away. So I'm going to save this part for sandwiches. This part I am going to turn, and you can slice it that way. But I prefer to turn it like this and slice it this way. But that all depends on what you're going to do with your bread. If you're making sandwiches, obviously you might not want to do that. If you're putting this in a bread basket and serving it, you might want to slice it this way. So I'm just going to cut it this way. So just take your knife and just cut you as many slices as you like. There we are. And you can always put those in a bread basket and serve them up, whether you're serving it with soup or you're serving it with chili or you're serving it with a salad or you're serving it with whatever you might want to serve it with. It will be delicious. Now, enough talking. It's time to taste. Now, this time, since I'm getting the first bite, I'm just going to have a piece of this. And, oh wow, look at the texture. So nice and soft. And you can tell the loaf is baked all the way through and is well risen because there's no gummy layer around the edge. All right, let's just have a taste. Thank you, Jesus. Sour. And sometimes when I'm really, really busy, I'll just eat a piece on its own. It doesn't need any other adornment, sourdough bread. If it's good bread, you should be able to eat it on its own. That's good. Thank you, Jesus. That is good. Can't wait to have this with dinner. So I hope you've enjoyed this how to bake your very first sourdough loaf video. If you have, please give the video a thumbs up. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And please, if you have any questions about sourdough baking, if you're in the middle of baking your first sourdough and you need an answer, please, to any question, please just feel free to hop in the comments, leave a comment, and I will be more than happy to assist you in any way I can. So the good Lord willing, I will see you guys in the next episode of our How to Start Your Own Sourdough Starter and Bake Your Own Sourdough Bread series. Take care, y'all. Bye.